We have a second honoree tonight, and our second honoree is one of the outstanding, truly great Americans of our generation, Judge James L. Buckley. 50 years ago, this fall, Jim cast off his successful business career to run for a U.S. Senate seat from New York. I was a supporter of his, and I was in my Minneapolis high school. I was very proud to show it. Many people were a little bit puzzled as to why I would have the button on, but that just gave me an opening to explain. It was wonderful. In a historic victory, Jim became, as his brother anointed him, the sainted junior senator from New York. His victory is seen by many conservatives, by many of us, as a bridge from the Goldwater campaign of 1964 and Bill's mayoral campaign of 1965 to the Reagan landslide of 1980. Jim's service in the United States Senate had many memorable aspects, including a complete reform of campaign finance. Another of, many of you may not know this, but another one of Jim's notable accomplishments was his sponsorship of a bill that repealed prohibition. No, not that prohibition. Specifically, the prohibition on American citizens from owning gold. It was against the law for American citizens to own gold from 1933 to 1974. And we may soon, I think, have extra reason to appreciate that particular freedom. Don't tell David Bahnsen this, but a little bit of gold is not a bad diversifier in this era. After his term in the United States Senate, Jim served as Undersecretary of State and as President of Radio Free Europe. In 1985, President Reagan nominated Jim to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, on which his distinguished service made him one of the very few people in American history to have served in high office in all three branches of the federal government. Through all of this, however, there was a blot. Jim recorded one remarkable failure. He was utterly unable to make any enemies. As Bill famously wrote of his older brother, Jim was a benign presence before whose phlegmatic charm razors are blunt and arrows detumesce. As you may note from our video tribute, I can attest personally to his willingness to encourage callow, if sincere, youngsters that come across his path. But before I ask you to indulge me in a few more remarks about Judge Buckley, perhaps we can enjoy some of the highlights of his career.
As a young man fresh out of Yale, James Lane Buckley first served his country in the Navy during World War II.
He's had an enormous impact on the conservative movement in so many different ways.
Jim Buckley is conservatives' man for all seasons. Jim Buckley is one of the very few Americans to serve in very, very high positions in all three branches of the government. But beyond that, what Jim Buckley has done is he's changed not just the United States, but he's changed the world.
His first foray into politics came in 1965 when he was talked into managing his brother's campaign for mayor of New York City. James was called upon to be a candidate himself just a few years later, challenging the liberal Republican U.S. Senator from New York. He thought the idea ridiculous, but agreed to run after being assured there was no chance whatever of winning. That might have been the end of James Buckley's political career, but these were turbulent times. Egged on by academia and the political class, protests, riots, lawlessness and violence rocked college campuses and American cities. Sound familiar? As American flags burned across the country, James Buckley felt called to defend America's ideals, challenging a liberal Republican for one of New York's seats in the United States Senate.
Why are most policemen backing Jim Buckley? I believe we've got to do more to protect all our citizens from the criminals among us. This means stamping out the drug traffic. This means tough diplomacy abroad and tough law enforcement at home.
Isn't it about time we had a senator? Buckley.
This time, building a coalition against the violent anti-Americanism sweeping the nation, he won.
To win a statewide election in New York as a self-avowed conservative, wow, that's spectacular.
A fearless conservative, Buckley would spend his years in the Senate defending the sanctity of life, supporting the firm traditional values that made America strong. He was victorious in a campaign finance case that he took all the way to the Supreme Court. In doing so, he transformed political campaigns for generations. Like his younger brother Bill, James Buckley always made time for young people, safeguarding the future of conservatism, no matter how busy his schedule.
There is an awareness among younger people of the extent to which government as such is getting too large and is smothering lives.
James Buckley would also prove one of those rare men, willing to put principles above political advancement. Understanding how Watergate and impeachment could tear the country apart, Senator Buckley took a stand as the first major conservative to call for Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974.
The character of a regime always reflects and expresses the character of its leaders. The captain is responsible for his ship, the commander for his army. And Mr. Nixon has explicitly recognized this responsibility.
Even more damaging to his political prospects, Buckley fought against a federal bailout of New York City, which was sinking under overspending and mismanagement. That might also sound familiar. Upholding his values may have cost him re-election. History wasn't done with James Buckley.
We're faced with an unprecedented situation in this country today.
From the legislative branch, he moved to the executive branch, appointed by President Ronald Reagan as Undersecretary of State in charge of military aid to countries battling the Soviet Union. As the president of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, Buckley propagated the message of freedom and democracy to nations enslaved by communism.
What he did at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, helped bring down the Iron Curtain.
Proud, principled service in 2 of the 3 branches of government, Buckley tackled the 3rd when he was appointed U.S. Court of Appeals judge for the District of Columbia Circuit, serving with distinction until 1996, and mentoring 2 future Supreme Court justices, Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice John Roberts.
I did have the privilege of seeing him work firsthand as a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals when I was a law clerk, and I was deeply impressed with his work ethic and his personality and demeanor. He was enormously humble and self-effacing, a great and thorough writer, and he had a great knack for wit and humor during oral arguments.
Even after departing the bench, James Buckley worked tirelessly to advance the causes of American freedom and prosperity, authoring influential books, including Freedom at Risk, published in 2010, and Saving Congress from Itself in 2014.
Jim's defense of federalism, of tailoring the role of the government so that it works for everybody, not just for people at the top, but not just for people at the bottom either, but for the whole of the American people.
Through his writings, Buckley resolutely and persuasively defends the foundational ideas of American federalism.
This is notable and important because respecting and enforcing federalism and other structural limits on government power contained in our Constitution are the best way to preserve the dignity and worth of every human person. And James Buckley understood that very, very well.
Tough diplomacy abroad and tough law enforcement at home. I pledge to devote my efforts to this cause. Total integrated programs. I plan to work for such programs in Washington.
James Buckley has spent a long, remarkable life as an exemplar of conservative values, defending America's ideals of freedom and justice from enemies within and without.
The rule of law matters for all of us. Hey, government is not the master of the people, government's the servant of the people. And Jim has always reminded us of that.
for his lifetime of service, advocacy for federalism, and defense of American exceptionalism. The 2020 William F. Buckley Jr. Prize for Leadership in Political Thought goes to James Lane Buckley.
Wow, I'm ready to vote Buckley. I'm ready to go. That was fabulous. It's not easy to capture such a large and consequential life, but that video did it pretty well. I want to thank my co-chairs for the gala this evening, Ed Fulner and Leonard Leo, for bringing that video to life and for all the other work they do in our common endeavors. It's greatly appreciated. But come back with me for a moment to the summer of 1976. I spent that very hot and humid summer in Washington, D.C. as a legislative assistant to Senator Paul Laxalt from Nevada. Back in that pre-security era, legislative aides could ride the short subway between the Russell Senate office building and the Capitol freely, and often with senators who were heading to a vote. It was quite something to squeeze in there and rub elbows with senators like Humphrey and John Glenn and Bob Dole and Barry Goldwater and Scoop Jackson, get out of my way because I got to get over there, and his Washington colleague Warren Magnuson and so many others. Magnuson, interestingly, would lose his seat finally in the Reagan landslide of 1980, but had, as a young congressman in 1940, appointed my father to the Naval Academy. It was the summer also of the bicentennial. I remember vividly the evening of July 4th, 1976, just as a group of us were headed out to the Ellipse to watch what promised to be a truly great fireworks extravaganza. The news broke of the Israeli raid on Entebbe and the dramatic rescue of all those hostages, with the loss of one Israeli commando, who was the older brother of a future prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. It was an astounding event, and it was suitable for grafting onto our own celebration. And it set the tone for a very long evening, I might say, of revelry, finishing up on Capitol Hill, watching the sun rise over the Capitol Dome as America began its third century. My office in the Russell Senate office building was a converted broom closet next to Senator Laxalt's large office. A large portion of my duties was to read proposed amendments to the gargantuan Tax Act of 1976 and to make some kind of recommendation, as if I had any idea, except it didn't sound like a good idea. Senator Laxalt, who finally decided that the whole damn thing was a monstrosity, nonetheless listened respectfully to my thoughts on the oil depletion allowance and various other aspects. In the course of one of these discussions, I mentioned to him I was an avid reader of National Review, and naturally an admirer of Senator Buckley. A week or so later, I got a call from Senator Buckley's office asking if I would like to walk over to his office and chat with the senator for a few minutes. The amendment to enhance the oil depletion allowance was going to have to wait. I cleared my schedule. I walked down the hall, and Senator Buckley just put me immediately at ease and signed my copy of his book, If Men Were Angels. We chatted amiably for 10 or 15 minutes as if he had nothing else to do in the world. Someone nicely took this picture, which does not, well, leaving aside the choice of clothing here and the haircut, but it just doesn't quite capture the wonder and delirium in my face. It was a high and inspirational moment for me 44 years ago. 1976 was also the summer of an intense contest for the Republican presidential nomination between the accidental incumbent President Ford and that dynamic governor from California. So happened, as you may know, Senator Laxalt was the national campaign chairman of Governor Reagan's campaign, and all summer there were intense and not really hushed discussions of strategy held in the big office right next to my broom closet. The race was razor close, and although I knew something was up, even I was astounded at the announcement in the Russell hearing room down the hall that Governor Reagan had chosen Pennsylvania Senator Richard Schweiker preemptively as his running mate. Alas, the gambit was not enough to pry loose the critical undecided delegates. Consequently, on the day before the convention in Kansas City, I was left back in Washington. I'm sure I was essential there. But on the day before the convention, there was uncertainty regarding the outcome of the first ballot. The redoubtable Senator Jesse Helms, who I must say was rather nonplussed with the very liberal Republican Senator Schweiker, decided that if Governor Reagan could not get over the top on the first ballot, perhaps there should be a compromise conservative candidate. And yes, as you may have noticed in the video, Senator Buckley allowed us how he would be available for such a draft. I remember being astonished for about the 50th time that summer, picking up the Washington Post on the front page above the fold, the story of Senator Buckley's imminent drafting as the compromise candidate, but it was not to be. More's the pity, I suppose, although it did seem to work out eventually. It was a great privilege to me to work in Washington that summer and to see up close some real giants of American government of that era. One of the finest of them is with us tonight. It is the honor of a lifetime for me, on behalf of National Review Institute, to present the 2020 William F. Buckley Jr. Prize for Leadership in Political Thought to the sainted junior senator from New York, Judge James L. Buckley.
Thank you all. It's great to be with you, if only electronically. I'm honored to receive this award because it certifies that I have proven a faithful custodian of my remarkable brother Bill's legacy. What a shame it is that Bill isn't here to help us thread our way to the strange world today and to explain the craziness which allows us to dismiss arson and looting as constitutionally sanctioned speech. But even if we move past the current headline-grabbing distractions, we remain confronted with some serious ongoing threats to constitutional government that I believe far too few Americans are aware of. So please forgive me if I focus on some truly serious concerns on what ought to be a cheerful, upbeat evening. Let me begin with our nation's beginning. The architects of the American Republic had no illusions about human nature, which is the one constant in human affairs. From their study, the history of the free societies reaching all the way back to ancient Greece, they understood that the drive to accumulate power, whether by a despot or individual or parliamentary majorities, is the big historic enemy of individual freedom. They therefore incorporated two safeguards into our Constitution: its system of separation of powers with its checks on potential abuses, and the principle of federalism as underscored by the 10th Amendment's command that all powers not assigned to the federal government be reserved to the people or the states. During our first 180-odd years, Washington largely observed those limits. But with the advent of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, Congress began a wholesale assumption of the state's responsibilities. As I explain in my book, Saving Congress from Itself, it has done so through a proliferation of federal programs that offer states and their subdivisions grants of money for purposes that are the state's exclusive responsibility. These grants come with the most detailed instructions on how the money is to be used. out of deference for the 10th Amendment, the Supreme Court has stipulated that Congress may not coerce the states into accepting them. 50 years of experience, however, has demonstrated that states find it enormously difficult to decline what it viewed as free money from Washington, however onerous the attached conditions. Thus, the practical effect of the court's decisions has been to empower Congress to bribe the states into accepting Washington's directives on matters that remain the state's exclusive responsibility. Members of Congress have become addicted to these programs because they deal with matters that are of the most intimate concern to their constituents, matters such as housing, schooling, job training, potholes, you name it. Therefore, their creation and the securing of grants offer members the easiest way to rub elbows with voters and generate the favorable headlines that will assure their reelection. As a consequence, whereas those programs distributed $24 billion in 1970 when I was elected to the Congress, by 2015, that figure had grown to almost $641 billion, or 1/6 of total federal spending and that year, and all for matters that are none of Washington's business. The result has been an avalanche of regulation-ridden programs that now provide federal subsidies for virtually every activity in which the states are engaged. They have thus converted the states in too many ways into mere administrators of programs created in Washington and overseen by bureaucrats who are the farthest removed from where the money is to be used. In short, those programs have effectively nullified the 10th Amendment. But that isn't the only way that Congress has been undermining the Constitution's safeguards. Over the years, it has also been chipping away at its separation of powers. The Constitution provides that, quote, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Thus, Congress is the sole legitimate source of federal laws. Responsible law writing, however, can be a difficult art, and the more complex the legislative details, the greater care is required to ensure that the finished product does nothing more nor less than what Congress intended. As I say, this is demanding work. So Congress has fallen into the habit of delegating ever more essentially legislative details to executive agencies that in turn produce the detailed regulations that give congressionally enacted laws their effect. In doing so, the agencies tend to resolve statutory ambiguities in ways that will meet their own objectives, which is more may or may not coincide with what Congress had in mind. Over time, the effect of all of this has been the creation of an extra-constitutional administrative state that both writes and administers the rules that now govern ever wider areas of American life. Procedures are in place that are intended to subject regulations to scrutiny before they can take effect. But the administrative state can sidestep them by simply writing letters, as it did recently when it advised schools that boys must be allowed to use girls' bathrooms so long as the boys thought of themselves as girls. And the administrative state gets away with such excesses because they have become so common in current practice that Congress too rarely raises any objections. So here we are today. Federalism is just a memory, and Congress's abdication of its own responsibilities have given us an expanding administrative state whose non-elected officials governed by regulatory fiat. As I noted in my book, an effective federalism is easily restored. All that is required is for Congress to strip the grants of federal directives telling the states how the money is to be used. This simple reform would once again allow accountable state and local officials rather than distant bureaucrats to determine how best to meet state and local problems. Unfortunately, Congress has thus far failed to follow my advice. Restoring the Constitution's allocation of governmental powers, however, will be a lot more difficult task. Over the past generation and more, our educators have abdicated their responsibility to ground their students into the fundamentals of the American experience. As a result, far too many of our people now suffer from a peculiar form of historical amnesia. They remember all our past sins, such as slavery and our treatment of the Indians, but far too few have a sufficient awareness of the constitutional and economic principles that, on the historical record, had made ours the most productive, prosperous, innovative, generous, and free society the world had known. Principles that were responsible for the freedoms and material well-being they take so much for granted. I have had to use the past tense, however, because our nation is no longer the world's freest. As a consequence, we have become a nation of constitutional illiterates. Few Americans have any understanding of the degree to which the Constitution's safeguards are being whittled away. So we need to remind them of their existence and hammer home the urgent need to bring the administrative state under effective constitutional control. That will be anything but easy, but it must be done. The challenge to preserve our republic has always been with us, but I suggest we are now facing an unprecedented threat. As Benjamin Franklin reminded us in the close of the Constitutional Convention, while the framers have given us a republic, it is up to us to keep it. I can think of no organization that is better able to assume that challenge today than the National Review Institute. So I urge you to focus all your considerable resources on reminding Americans of the constitutional sources of their blessings and of the utter seriousness of the present threat. You have your marching orders. God bless you all.
Fabulous. Jim, we salute you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Those were very, very powerful remarks. They were wonderful. It's great to see you. I see you're joined by your son, David. Thank you both for being with us.
Well, it is a joy to be with you, and I'm astonished at the wonderful electronic gala you've given us tonight. Bless you all.
It's a type of hide the ball. We see what's happening, but it was wonderful to see your remarks, and they really were powerful and greatly appreciated. It is an honor, of course, to us that you accept this award from us. So thank you again, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Hope you see my button. I've kept that carefully for many years. Buckley forever.